to the Free Library of Philadelphia. I'm Liza Seltzer, one of this library's biggest fans and a member of the Pepper Society for nearly 20 years. I was very young when I joined. From its award-winning author event series to unique collections of rare books, photographs, prints, and more, the Free Library is dedicated to advancing literacy, guiding learning, and inspiring curiosity. Many of the library's most beloved programs and services are made possible only with the help of private support. A gift of whatever amount you are able helps the Free Library transform lives. So be a part of that. It really does matter. It's very easy to make a donation, the quickest way being online, so please do so at freelibrary.org/support. Tonight, it is my pleasure to introduce the acclaimed journalist and best-selling writer, Cokie Roberts. Covering politics, Congress, and public policy, Cokie Roberts is a senior news analyst for National Public Radio, a political commentator for ABC News, and the co-author of a popular syndicated weekly newspaper column that she writes with her husband. For her work, she has earned the Edward R. Murrow Award, 3 Emmys, and in 2008, the Library of Congress honored her with the rare title of Living Legend. Cokie's also the author of several best-selling books, including We Are Our Mother's Daughters, Founding Mothers, and Ladies of Liberty. In her new book, Capital Dames, she marks the sesquicentennial of the Civil War by exploring the contributions of Washington, D.C.'s women during this watershed American epoch. Compelling social history at its best, Capital Dames argues that the Civil War not only changed Washington, it also forever changed the role of women in American society. We're so very pleased to have her with us this evening. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Cokie Roberts to the Free Library.
Hello, how are you? What a treat to be here with all of you tonight. I love this library. Is it the most fabulous resource you have? Yes. It's a really special place, and this theater is wonderful. Andy was reminding me that I've been here several times, and I'm now realizing the lectern was lower and I was taller. Many of you relate to that. Now on airplanes, it's really hard to reach up. And it's not because the suitcase is heavy, it's because the overhead bin is far. But one of the reasons I'm thrilled to be here is because I do know what a special place this is, and do want to always come back with every new book, because it's incredible to come to this library, which has served this fabulous city for so long, now more than 100 years, and actually this building will soon have its centennial, and I'm sure you'll be asked to add to it, and that's a good thing, because of all the wonderful programs that happen here. So I am delighted to be here. I am delighted that I'm always here. So if I say some of the same jokes, just laugh, because who knows what I've said before. And if you remember, good for you. But the truth is that I did start writing women's history back in, it's sort of hard to figure out whether the first book was women's history or not. It kind of was. We Are Our Mother's Daughters, which came out in 1998, and I was remembering it today because we were getting all kinds of emails about the Pope going to Cuba before he comes to America. And with that book, the Pope of the time, John Paul, was in Cuba. And ABC was laying on just incredible coverage of the Pope in Cuba. And we flew down on a private plane because, it wasn't easy to get there and all of that. And I had researched it, within an inch of its life, and had spent the day, going around Havana and interviewing people and all that. And then that night, we were sitting at dinner in the bar or the restaurant that Ernest Hemingway, whatever, and the primitive cell phones that some of our numbers had started ringing, and we discovered that the president had had an affair with an intern and lied. It was so depressing. The next day I am standing poolside in Havana, and the Pope comes in, and Peter Jennings comes to me for a little analysis of the Pope's visit, and they sort of go around the horn, and then comes back to me for an analysis of the president and the intern, right? And then we all get on a plane and fly back to New York. So we missed that Pope's visit to Cuba, so I'd sort of like to enjoy this one's. At that time, my mother, who's really been the inspiration for my books, was representing the president as a diplomat at the Vatican. She was, yes, the ambassador to the Holy See during this period in history. And so she was representing Bill Clinton to the Pope. Now, President Clinton says to me, the Pope liked me, Cokie. And I'm sure that's absolutely true. But it was the toughest job in the diplomatic service. And she then went home to Bourbon Street, New Orleans, where her home was. It was as odd as it could possibly be. When my children were small, we'd walk past the strippers and the other neighbors, and I'd say, through the woods and over the hills to grandmother's house we go. And then when she moved from Bourbon Street to the Vatican, I teased her that the costumes hadn't changed. It was still guys in dresses, right? But before her last public service incarnation as ambassador to the Vatican, she had been in various roles. The one before that, officially, she had been a member of Congress for 9 terms. But before that, she had been a congressional wife. And my father, Hale Boggs, was elected to Congress from Louisiana when he was 26 years old, and Mama was 24. And it was 1940. It was before World War II. And Washington was very similar then to what it was in the years of the books that I write about. The period, it really starting from the creation of the city as the national capital in 1800 on until World War II. It was very similar, where there were certain protocols in place that had to be observed. And the main one for women was calling. And you had to go, calling on the cabinet on Monday, the Senate on Tuesday, the House on Wednesday, the court on Thursday, receive on Friday. I have the days wrong, I'm sure, but that was the basic idea. In the books that I write, the women are always, chafing about the calling because it's so onerous. My mother tells the story of when she got there at 24 years old, and then 24 you were actually a grown-up. No. You weren't still on your parents' insurance. When I was 20, I was so amused when your children can stay on your parents' insurance till they're 26. When I was 26, I had 2 children, But at any rate, my mother had 2 children, neither of whom was me. And for her first day to have to go calling, the horn honks outside, and it's Lady Bird Johnson and Pauline Gore. And they became fast friends forever. And they and many Republican women, including Betty Ford, who gave me the daunting honor of asking me to eulogize her before she died. I would have been terrified, except she told me exactly what she wanted me to say, so made it easier. But that that group of women were so incredibly important. They ran everything. They ran the political conventions, they ran the voter registration drives, they ran their husbands' campaigns, they ran us kids, of course. And along with the African American women in Washington, they ran all the social service agencies. And so I knew how incredibly important these women were in the Washington that I grew up in the 1940s and 50s. In fact, when my mother then did run for Congress after my father was killed in a plane crash, she called Mrs. Johnson so that Lady Bird wouldn't read about it in the newspaper. And she said, I'm running for the seat. And Mrs. Johnson said, well, that's great, Lindy, but how are you going to do it without a wife? So I knew their role, and I knew how incredibly important it was. And I, as someone who has covered politics and Congress forever, people keep introducing me as, decades in broadcasting. In fact, today I was at WHYY, and the person who was introducing talked about 60 years. And fortunately, she was talking about WHYY. Not 60. I'm sure it's not 60. Yeah, but in broadcasting, I mean. Although my family might argue that. But at any rate, so I started writing about women in history based on what my knowledge was of these fabulous women, because I knew that the women of the periods that I had to deal with all the time in dealing with covering Congress and politics, which was mainly the founding period, that those women must have been at least as influential in this unique and crucial period of our history, the founding. And I wanted to know what they were up to, and when I went to try to find out, I couldn't. And so I had to do extensive research, and once I'd done that, I might as well write about it. So I had written these books about this period that I cared about deeply. I never intended to write a Civil War book. It was not even slightly on my agenda. First of all of my ancestors fought on the losing side. And Americans killed each other by the hundreds of thousands. We lost 600,000 plus American lives in that war. And I just didn't want to deal with it. But the publisher did. And so I then started thinking, well, okay, what am I going to do? What am I going to write? And obviously it was going to be about women, but I didn't know what. I did know one thing, which was that whatever I wrote, I would be reading other people's mail, which is always fun. And I knew that women's letters would be utterly delightful, and I would learn a great deal from them. I've, in writing the other books, it's been one of my favorite things, which was to find letters that had not been published. And even if they had been published, these particular letters wouldn't have shown up in men's histories because they wouldn't have thought them important. But the fabulous thing about women's letters is that they are all important because they're not meant to be important. The men's letters are meant to be important, It's as if they're written by the marble and bronze statues. And the women's letters are letters. And they are funny, and they're frank, and they're fresh, and they're feisty, and they talk politics all the time and tell you everything that's going on politically, but they also tell you who's having babies and all too often losing them, what the fashions are, what the economic situation is, who's doing what, and all of that. And my personal favorite remains, even after writing this book, where I found some fabulous letters, but my personal favorite still remains one from the last history book, Ladies of Liberty, which was about the early republic. I came upon this letter written by Louisa Catherine Adams, John Quincy Adams' wife, and after Abigail Adams died, Louisa would write these very chatty, gossipy letters back to John Adams, her father-in-law, the former president, just to cheer him up. He was, back in Massachusetts. She was in Washington as the Secretary of State's wife, where, by the way, she described her vocation as getting her husband elected president. Yeah. And so the year 1820 is the year of the Missouri Compromise, and Congress stays in session a long time to hammer out the compromise. And finally they adjourn. She goes to a meeting of the trustees of the Orphan Asylum that Dolly Madison had founded after the British invasion. And so she gets there, and one of the trustees says to her that they're going to need a new building. And she says, why? The answer is, and I'm quoting, the session had been very long. The fathers of the nation had left 40 cases to be provided for by the public, and our institution was the most likely to be called upon to maintain this illicit progeny. 40 pregnant women left behind by the Congress, and there were only like 200 members of Congress. I mean, some of them might have been recidivist, I don't know, but and so then she says to John Adams, I recommended a petition to Congress next session for that great and moral body to establish a foundling institution, and should certainly move that the $2 additional a day which they have given themselves as an increase in pay may be appropriated as a fund toward the support of the institution. That doesn't get any better than that. And that letter had never seen the light of day until I made sure it did. And so I knew I would find something wonderful. And in fact, her daughter-in-law, Abigail Brooks Adams, turned out to be one of the best letter writers that I found. Again, unpublished letters. And she was in Washington. Her husband, Charles Francis Adams, John Quincy's son, John Quincy and Louisa's son, was in Congress just for a session, but it was the infamous session where the South seceded. And then he went on to become the Union's ambassador to the Court of St. James. But during that session, she was writing these wonderful letters home to her son, Henry Adams. And she says, President Buchanan is a heavy old toad. And then the Senate behaved like children, and silly ones at that. We can all get behind that one. And my personal favorite, I would advise any young woman who wishes to have an easy, quiet life not to marry an Adams. So I knew I would be fine with the letters, but I still didn't know what the book was going to be. I knew I'd enjoy learning what it was going to be, but I didn't know what it was going to be. And then I started thinking, well, I had grown up in Washington in the post-World War II period. And actually, when I was growing up, there were these what were called temporary buildings. I remember asking my parents what temporary meant, and they had trouble explaining it to me since the buildings didn't go away. But they were all over the National Mall, and they were buildings that had been built during World War I as the government expanded to deal with the war and the burgeoning federal government, and they were basically Quonset huts. They were very ugly. I started wondering, I wonder, has Washington changed so much as a result of the wars, mainly World War II? Was something similar true in the Civil War? And also, I knew, of course, that the role of women had changed dramatically as a result of World War II. I mean, we know about Rosie the Riveter. We know about government girls coming in and flooding the bureaucracies that had been established during the war, but also that women's place had changed. After the war, that's when the Equal Rights Amendment was introduced for the first time, first in the Republican platform, then the Democratic platform. That's when women started going to college in large numbers. The GI Bill sent 60,000 women to college, and leading us to where we are today, where the majority of graduates are female, and the vast majority of graduate school graduates are female. Eat your hearts out, guys. But so I knew that World War II had this profound impact. And I started wondering, well, maybe that's the story. Maybe the story is that the Civil War had a similar impact. And I found, in fact, it did. And that turned out to be an absolutely fascinating story. And it's particularly fascinating told through the words, the letters, the diaries of the women themselves, which was, of course, a wonderful treat to get to know them and to read their mail and their diaries even more. I had a children's book of founding mothers come out last year, and I went around to schools and I talked to the children about, where you learn history, and told them that you read the letters, and I saw their looks on their faces, and I said, it's okay, they're dead. But when you talk about Rosie the Riveter, there were Rosie the Riveters in the Civil War. There were women who went and worked in the arsenals, unbelievably dangerous work, stuffing the cartridges. And in Washington, in fact, there was a horrible arsenal explosion that killed a couple of dozen very young women. And the newspaper accounts are just horrifying to read. And by the way, the newspapers are completely available now, online. You can read newspapers from the end of the 18th century on, and it's just fabulous. You can waste days. And because their ads are all there, they're terrific. But you can read what the people you're writing about were reading. And you can read about them in the newspapers. So that's, a delight. But the accounts of this arsenal explosion were so horrific because the bodies were unrecognizable. Some were identified by their shoes, but what one reporter commented on was how they were all trapped in their hoop skirts, and how they were still dressing so properly to go do this dangerous work. And at the time, it was the middle of the summer in Washington. It was horribly hot, but they were well-dressed mid-19th century women, and killed them. The funeral was thousands of people led by the president and the secretary of war, and there's a great monument to them in the congressional cemetery, but they're dead. They'd be dead by now anyway, but but it was a horrific incident. Government girls. Women started showing up in Washington to make a living. The men were gone, and they showed up at pretty much the same time that Congress passed a law permitting the printing of paper money to pay for the war. Now, paper money still comes off the printing press in these enormous sheets, right? But now, of course, machines cut them up into bills. Then it was women sitting with a pair of scissors and cutting them out, bill by bill by bill. And the Treasurer of the United States, General Skinner, said women are better with scissors than men. And he also said he could pay them less, something NPR has always felt. And by the end of the war, one of the journalists who was there, Mary Clemmer Ames, wrote that there were women of education in every department of government. And that was the case. And they didn't go home. They stayed and changed the place of women in government and the place of women in the world. Ms. Ames is another example of a profession that really blossomed for women during the war, which was journalism. There had been women journalists in Washington before the war. One of them, Jane Swisshelm, was the first to be allowed to write out of the press gallery in the Capitol, but she was quickly kicked out of it because she wrote vicious truths, and she did describe the fact that Daniel Webster was a drunk, and it reminded me so much of what happened in my lifetime with women journalists, because we'd go on the campaign trail and we'd write what was going on. We hadn't taken the Pledge of Omerta And I remember once being on the Brinkley show, and of course I was the only woman, and saying, well, it's coverage of politicians is different when women are doing it. We do feel that everything they do and how they treat women and all of that is a character issue, and it matters. And we do come home and talk about what happens on the bus, and we talk about it with our friends, many of whom are the wives of other reporters. And there was this moment of just stark terror in the studio. I mean, the men just all sat there with this look on their faces of, oh my God, right? The timekeeper for the program told me later that she was in the control room, and there was 45 seconds of total silence as they absorbed this terrifying piece of information. But there were plenty of women journalists. They came and they stayed. And then there are women that you know about, like Dorothea Dix and Clara Barton, but I suspect you don't know that much about them, or unless you have made it a point, because it's hard. Nobody teaches it. But Dorothea Dix was so influential that before the war, the Senate actually gave her an office in the Capitol from which to lobby. And she was lobbying for a bill to have the federal government put aside more than 12 million acres for the mentally ill and the poor. And she actually got it through eventually 2 houses of Congress, and then President Pierce vetoed it. But in the course of her life, she established more than 100 mental health institutions, including 2 in Japan. And she, in the Civil War, was the head. She was the superintendent of female nurses. And one of the things you don't really think about is there were no female nurses before the Civil War. That was not a field open to women. And because of her and Clara Barton and others, that became women's work. And the whole medical field opened up much more. There were only a few women doctors in the country at the time, one of whom was Mary Walker, who was a surgeon, and she came to Washington to work for the Union Army and found herself working as a volunteer. But she then went to the front and had some terrible things happen, and she is still the only woman to have ever received the Medal of Honor. They tried to take it away from her, but she got it back. So, there are stories that of women like that. And Clara Barton, you do know about, but here's what history books say. She founded the Red Cross. Really? Was it hard? Did it take any effort? Did anything go before that? And her story is, a story of a woman who was a New England daughter of a suffragist, abolitionist, always chafed against the fact that men made more money than she did. Even in the 1840s, this was a huge cause of hers. Came to Washington, worked in the government. The war started. Massachusetts troops start to show up. She starts helping them. People send her supplies when they write home and say she's the person to send them to. And she eventually has 3 warehouses full of supplies, and the quartermaster general sends her to the front. She's becomes an incredible nurse, the angel of the battlefield, going through unbelievable hardships. After the war, she sets up a missing persons bureau and identifies missing soldiers, but also the graves of tens of thousands of soldiers she finds and marks. And then she goes to Europe and discovers something called the Red Cross. Comes home and establishes this country, but in order to allied with the International Red Cross, the United States Senate had to ratify the Geneva Conventions. And so she worked for 2 decades lobbying the Senate to ratify the Geneva Conventions, the same ones we talk about today. And then she went to Geneva and had the treaty include what's called the American Amendment, which allows the Red Cross to go into natural disasters as well as war zones. So today, when you're reading about the Red Cross in Nepal after the earthquake, that's Clara Barton. And she did that, and it took her decades to do it, but she did it. I was, of course, most interested in the political women because of what I do for a living, and one of the most interesting of them was Jessie Benton Fremont, whose father, Thomas Hart Benton, was a senator from Missouri, and then her husband, who she had run off with, the swashbuckling explorer, John C. Fremont, becomes the first senator from California, and that whole story is quite fabulous. And then he becomes the first Republican nominee of the brand new Republican Party. He's the first nominee for president in 1856. And she is totally out front. She is on the stage. She's not behind the scenes at all. The posters are Fremont and our Jessie. No one had a clue who was the vice presidential candidate. And all the newspapers talk about how she could explain the platform better than anybody. And she was completely in the public eye, so much so that one of the Democratic papers, disgusted by this, said that what the poster should read was, for president, John C. Fremont, in little tiny letters, husband of Jessie Benton. Then when the war started and he was a general, she was called General Jessie. It was not meant as a compliment. And and when he got in trouble with Lincoln, she showed up at the White House and berated the president, which is another thing that I just can't get over. These women were marching into the White House all of the time, telling presidents off. And I am so jealous. And but one of them, who I came to really love, was Verena Davis, the wife of Jefferson Davis. And before the war, she was really one of the prime hostesses in Washington. They called themselves Belles. And it was a difficult marriage, but she was well regarded in Washington. And she was very upset when one of the other Belles, who was a teenager, that's the other thing, these women were also young, was about to marry Stephen Douglas. And this Belle was Adele Cutts, and she was the great niece of Dolly Madison. Everybody loved her. She was beautiful, she was kind, and she was brilliant. And everyone wrote about her. She's my most elusive woman because I have hardly any of her own letters. I have letters to her, but hardly any of her own. So when it turned out that she was about to marry Stephen Douglas, the senator from Illinois, who of course defeated Lincoln, Verena Davis was furious. And she writes to her mother and says, "The dirty speculator and party trickster, broken in health by drink, with his first wife's money, buys an elegant, well-bred woman because she is poor and her father is proud." And Verena says, "It's a good thing a new water system is coming to Washington because, sparing his wife's olfactories, Douglas may wash a little oftener. If he don't, his acquaintance will build larger rooms with more perfect ventilation." So you don't learn from the men that Stephen Douglas smelled bad. She's actually one of the most interesting people in the book. She had a very difficult time as First Lady of the Confederacy because she knew from the beginning it would not work, that the Confederacy was a lost cause. And she stayed in close touch with her friends in the North. And then after the war, she and Jefferson Davis had a very hard time. She got him out of jail. She berated Andrew Johnson until he let him out of jail. But they kind of batted around the world with Jefferson Davis looking to try to make a living, and they'd separate for periods of time and all that. And then he finally died. And she decided to move to New York. The South was outraged. The First Lady of the Confederacy going to New York. They offered her a house in Richmond. She said no, she did need to make a living. She was olive complected. She had never been sufficiently pale for a perfect Southern belle. And as she was getting ready to go to New York, she wrote to her daughter and said, "I am free, brown, and 64. I can do whatever I want to do." But when she got there, she made a living as a journalist, but she befriended Julia Grant. And it was an act of very conscious reconciliation. It was on page 1 of all the newspapers. And then she went to the dedication of the Grant Memorial. And she knew what she was doing was helping to bring the sections of the country back together. And that turned out to be true of many of these women. Another one of the great belles, who actually wrote a book about herself called A Belle of the 50s, Virginia Clay, whose husband was in the Senate from Alabama before the war. After the war, she had been a delightful, charming, amusing woman. After the war, she became an ardent suffragist and was on platforms all over the country with Horace Greeley and Mrs. William Lloyd Garrison, people her husband had bitterly fought before the war. Again, working for a cause, working on the public stage, but also working for reconciliation. Another one of the Southern women, Sarah Pryor, who became a very well-known and heralded writer, also was a social reformer and did a lot of work on relief and other things. But she, with some of her Northern friends who had stayed true to the Union while she had left for the Confederacy, formed the Daughters of the American Revolution and the Colonial Dames, reaching back into an earlier period in American history when the country was unified and trying to remind people of that period. So they became very different people, and they became actors on the public stage instead of influencers behind the scenes. And Clara Barton, a couple of decades after the war, at a Memorial Day address, and Memorial Day was another thing established by the women to try to bring people together, she said, "Woman was at least 50 years in advance of the normal position which continued peace would have assigned her." So the war really did make an enormous difference in the lives of American women and in the lives of the nation and in the life of the nation's capital. I loved getting to know them. I know you will too. And I'm thrilled to be able to talk to you about them briefly, and I'd be delighted to take your questions. Thank you very, very much. Thank you. So there are microphones attached to nice women in each aisle. So questions? I think you'd need to do it into the microphone because of the podcast.
In terms of the current society, there's a lot of focus, of course, on Hillary Clinton and Elizabeth Warren. Could you identify and talk about 2 or 3 younger women in politics that you admire and think have real prospects for contributing?
Yeah, there are quite a few. I mean, we now have 20 women in the Senate, which is certainly not proportionate to the percentage in society, but it's a whole lot more than ever was the case, for most of my life when the maximum was 2. And you have someone like Kirsten Gillibrand from New York, who's a very up-and-coming young woman in the Senate, and Lisa Murkowski, a Republican woman from Alaska. I mean, there are quite a few. And what the women in the Senate are clear on, and they are very explicit about this, they are pretty much the only bastion of bipartisanship in the Senate, and they have a regular dinner together at least once a month. I always accuse them of just wanting to be in a testosterone-free zone, and they admit that that's true, but they also say they get a great deal done, and they do. And in fact, and Kelly Ayotte, another young Republican woman who's part of that group, she, when the government shut down, who was really a freshman from New Hampshire that had not been in the Senate before, all of that, she started working with Democratic women to get the government back up and running. And basically the women's reaction was, "Oh, for God's sake, this is our job is for the government to be running. Let's make that happen. So there are quite a few.
Thank you. You've been marvelous.
Thank you.
I have questions, though, about women of, let's say, lower middle class, people that were not part of the Bells. How did they actually get to Washington? How could they afford to stay in Washington? And how did they really leave their families at that time when daughters were so important for the family as a whole?
Well, but the daughters were important to make the money at that point. I don't know how they actually got there. I assume they got there by train and whatever other means they could get there by. Affording to stay in Washington was a serious issue, and some of them were considered wayward women because they couldn't live on their meager government salaries, and they took up other forms of employment, and so it was always an issue, because there was a discussion about whether they, were all government women wayward, and that conversation absolutely did take place, and that's one of the reasons why the journalists wrote by the end of the war that these were educated people in all the departments, particularly as the war wore on and more women came. Members of Congress started seeing this as a perk, as a way to appoint them. This is where civil service first came in, because the members of Congress were the people appointing the women, and they sometimes made their demands, and it was very out front and written about. So the women did have to protect their virtue in order to be accepted, but on the other hand, some of them couldn't in order to make a living. So it was a genuine issue. Yes.
With our heads getting smaller and our thumbs getting larger, you're talking about all the letters written, and the media would jump on anything you wrote now. What will happen to future historians trying to find something?
It's a real issue. What will people use when there are no letters? For a while, I really thought emails would solve the problem, because even though emails are not necessarily beautifully written and all of that, they do tell a story, particularly in a family. There are lots of emails when somebody's going off to school. There are lots of emails when somebody's getting married. There are lots of emails when somebody's sick. There are lots of emails when somebody dies. So there are stories told, and my advice always was print them up, and if you feel bad about that, do it on recycled paper. But hold on to them because they do tell a story. And one of my favorite examples of how it doesn't need to be something eloquent was from a book that Steve and I wrote about marriage, where we had a chapter on pioneer marriages. And the women the people who went west in the early part of the 19th century understood they were doing something extraordinary. And many of them kept diaries. And one of them was a woman who had been born in Maine in 1811, so early in the century. And she was a missionary and moved to Oregon, very difficult situation. And one day her diary entry says, was up at 5, baked 9 loaves of bread, taught at the school, was delivered of a son. And, that's basically a tweet. And so, but you get a very good sense of her life. And so that was my hope, was that we could have the equivalent of that. Now, with Instagram and texting and all of that, I suspect if you're subpoenaed that they can be pulled out of the cloud. But it is a real issue. And I don't really know what the answer is going to be. The other problem is the children aren't being taught cursive, so they won't be able to read the letters. I mean, reading these 18th and 19th century letters is hard anyway, because people were so careful about paper that they write this way and then they write this way. And I actually had to hire somebody to decipher the letters because it was too hard for me. Yeah. Yes.
Since you were talking about email, how big a deal is it that Hillary used her private email address as Secretary of State?
It plays into a perception about, and it's not just her, it's always the Clintons, playing fast and loose and all of that. So far as we can tell in the polling, it's not affecting any votes. The people who distrust Hillary Clinton already distrust Hillary Clinton and aren't going to vote for her. But it's possible that there becomes a cumulative sense of distrust, and we'll have to track that and see where it goes.
The Civil War period that you wrote about was intensely partisan, as is today. What is your take on the cause of the personal attacks that the president is subjected to today?
Well, I do think there's an element of racism. But I also have to remind you that there were plenty of very personal attacks against George Bush. And I think that what we're dealing with is well, first of all, we're dealing with an entire environment that is nasty. You know, bumper stickers are rude. And you know, people shouting on television and on the radio, and blogs are horrible. And comments on stories. I mean, I don't normally read them, but on the rare occasion when I do, they're just rude and horrible, and certainly not enlightening. So I think that we're living in that kind of atmosphere. But the Washington of today is also a place where people don't know each other, so it's easy to demonize someone that you don't know. That's unlike the pre-Civil War period. The pre-Civil War period was the most partisan time we've ever had. People always say to me, is this the most partisan time we've ever had? No. They're not shooting each other. Metal detectors, good. But that was the most partisan time, but it led to war. We don't want to see a repeat of that. And I do think that we are very lucky that there is not a major moral issue like slavery. There's nothing like slavery as an issue. But because I don't think that we have at the moment people who would know how to resolve it. And that's what happened before the Civil War. It was such a failure of statesmanship and of politicians doing what you're supposed to do as a politician, which is find compromise. And they couldn't figure out how to do it, and 600,000 American lives later, you got to the point. Now, maybe that was the only way to end slavery. I don't know. If that's the case, then I would argue it's worth it. But I find it hard to believe that was the only way to do it, because there were all kinds of things going on to make it possible.
Can you talk about what was the relationship between white women and free black women during the period you discussed?
Well, the most famous relationship between a white woman and a free black woman was the relationship between Mary Todd Lincoln, who I haven't talked about, one of the most complicated people on earth, and Elizabeth Keckley. And Elizabeth Keckley was a formerly enslaved person who bought her freedom, came to Washington. She was a highly, highly talented couturier, and was hired by all of the prominent women in Washington to make their special gowns. And when Mary Lincoln came to town, she wanted the best. And so she hired Elizabeth Keckley. And the women of Washington never warmed up to Mary Lincoln. It was partly their fault, partly her fault, but it became more and more her fault. And she became very, very close to Elizabeth Keckley, who was by far her closest confidant. And Mrs. Keckley took care of Willie as he was sickened and died, and then she took care of Mary Lincoln after Abraham Lincoln was shot, and Mary Lincoln stayed in the White House for 2 months, basically out of her mind. And then Mrs. Keckley went home to Illinois with Mrs. Lincoln and helped get her set up and all of that. And then she wrote a tell-all book. And, just like today. And that book, although it ruptured their relationship and essentially ruined the business because other clients were worried she might write about them, and African Americans thought she had betrayed Lincoln. But that book gives us tremendous insight into the Lincoln White House because the president and first lady had conversations with her there that they had no hesitancy about having, and Mrs. Lincoln also would just rail against cabinet members to Mrs. Keckley. So there was a very, very close relationship. She then, Elizabeth Keckley, after the business pretty much went under, was able to pursue what her tremendous interest was, which was to help the freed slaves. And she had understood before almost anybody the terrible position that formerly enslaved people would be in when they no longer had the plantation system. And so when people started arriving in Washington before emancipation, where they were either escaping to Washington or had gone to the Union Army and the Army had brought them to Washington, she saw the dire situation and created a contraband relief association. And because she had such influential friends, she was able to raise a great deal of money and a great deal of awareness. And then after emancipation, it became a Freedmen's Association, and she was very, very involved in that. She's also the person who introduced Sojourner Truth to Abraham Lincoln. And that conversation is one of the most interesting in history. So, yeah.
You have referenced a couple of times the breakdown in civil discourse in the pre-Civil War period. To what extent do you believe that we are in a similar situation today, and where do you think that path leads?
Well, as I said earlier, fortunately, we do not have an overriding moral issue, or even an overriding issue, period. Obamacare doesn't cut it. And so the fact is that there's a tremendous amount of partisanship and polarization, and there's a poisonous atmosphere, but it's not over anything. It's just, it's just that they don't like each other. And so that really does make it less dangerous, because it's not like they're ready to go to the mat on something, because they don't even know what they don't have issues. They just have attitudes. I'm told one more. The hook is here.
Thank you. Cokie, the women you write about presumably did not have any higher education, because for
Some
women... So my question is, how did they get the eloquence that you describe
that's
in writing
a
letters?
very interesting question. They were privately educated. First of all, by the time they came along, there were some very fine women's schools. Starting here with the Philadelphia Female Academy, right after the Revolutionary War, because there was a very strong view after the Revolution that this experiment called America was something that was so radical that you had to figure out how to keep it going. And the only way you could keep it going was through virtuous citizens. Well, how are you going to raise virtuous citizens? Whoops, mother was called into play. And so in order for mother to be able to raise a virtuous son, she needed an education. And so that was really the beginning of not massive, but many fine women's schools. And here in Philadelphia, the Young Female Academy, it was called, it has wonderful records. And all the famous people were on the board. And actually in I don't know, one of my books, I wrote about the graduation ceremony, and I just have such a wonderful mental image of this. It was May in Philadelphia. I'm sure the rhododendron were all in bloom. It must have been spectacularly beautiful. The girls were probably all in long white, with their hair up, just looking so lovely. And one of them, Priscilla Mason, who was the salutatorian, had been named the orator of the class. And she gets up with all the, the teachers and the board of trustees, which included Benjamin Rush and all of that, standing there. And, they expecting her to just thank everybody. And she says that she, as an orator, cannot move forward into the fields that she should be into. The Senate, the church, are closed off to me. Why? Because man, evil man, has closed. You go, Priscilla. It's great. But there were some fine female academies, and there was a lot of reading in the same way that law was read in lawyers' offices. It wasn't taught in law schools. There was a lot of reading in educated people's homes. So, well, and that's what this library is. I'll come back to that. That's what this library is about. This library is about providing education for people who don't have access, particularly, for everybody, but particularly for people who don't have access to fine institutions. This is the fine institution where they're going to get educated, and the city of Philadelphia should be deeply grateful and very supportive. Thank you very, very much.